In today's video, we are going to find out what would happen if all of the ice on Earth melted overnight. It could lead to the extinction of the human species and many other species with us. When temperatures rise above this level, ice crystals begin to vibrate more rapidly. At their breaking point, the bonds between the molecules break and they turn into liquid water. And when this happens on a large scale, it can cause rising sea levels, flooding, and even earthquakes. Let's take a look at what happens to ice at 25 degrees Celsius. At 25 degrees Celsius, almost all of the ice would have melted. At this point, only a small amount of ice would remain in Antarctica. Only a small amount of ice would remain in Antarctica. Sea levels would rise by about 70 meters or 230 feet, which is 196 feet higher than the current average sea level. Well, it's important to study climate change and the potential consequences of rising sea levels. Studying the impacts of climate change can help us to understand the challenges that we face, but it can also inspire us to find solutions. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode. See you next time, because it helps us to understand the risks that we are facing and to develop plans to mitigate those risks. For example, by studying how ice sheets melt, we can better predict how sea levels will rise in the future. And this can help us to prepare for the impacts of rising sea levels, such as coastal flooding. By understanding the risks associated with climate change, we can also develop policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and slow down the rate of climate change. Additionally, studying the impacts of climate change can also help us to identify opportunities for innovation and economic growth. For example, as sea levels rise, there will be a need for new technologies to protect coastal areas from flooding. And as the climate changes, there will be opportunities to develop new products and services to help people adapt to the new environment. This would flood most of the coastal cities and force millions of people to flee inland. Many countries would be completely underwater, such as the Netherlands, Bangladesh, and the Maldives. Global temperatures would rise by several degrees, leading to more extreme weather events such as storms, floods, and droughts. Many species would go extinct, and the climate would be very different from what we know today. The planet would be unrecognizable with most of the ice caps and glaciers gone. The global climate would be much warmer and wetter. The weather would be more extreme with more storms and floods. The planet would be unrecognizable with most of the ice caps and glaciers gone. The global climate would be much warmer and wetter. The weather would be more extreme with more storms and floods. At 150 degrees Celsius, 99.9% of the ice would have melted, and sea levels would be about 90 meters or 295 feet higher than today. Only a tiny amount of ice would remain in Antarctica and a few small ice caps. The planet would be unrecognizable with most of the ice caps and glaciers gone. The global climate would be much warmer and wetter. The weather would be more extreme with more storms and floods. Only the largest glaciers and ice caps would still exist. At this point, sea levels would be about 60 meters or 200 feet higher than today. Most coastal cities would be underwater, and millions of people would be forced to migrate inland. Global warming of this magnitude would have serious consequences for the environment. Many species would go extinct, and the climate would become much drier and more extreme. But not all ice melts at the same temperature. At this temperature, 99% of the ice would have melted and sea levels would be about 70 meters or 230 feet higher than today. Only a few small glaciers and ice caps would remain. Global temperatures would be much higher and the climate would be very different from what we know today. At 75 degrees Celsius, almost all of the ice would have melted and sea levels would be about 75 meters or 246 feet higher than today. Only a tiny amount of ice would remain in Antarctica and a few small ice caps. The planet would be unrecognizable with most of the ice caps and glaciers gone. The global climate would be much warmer and wetter. The weather would be more extreme with more storms and floods. Sea levels would rise by 75 meters or 246 feet. This would flood most of the coastal cities and force millions of people to flee inland. Many countries would be completely underwater, such as the Netherlands, Bangladesh, and the Maldives. Can you imagine how much water would be released into the oceans? Most rivers freeze over in winter, forming a layer of ice on the surface. This ice can be quite thick and can last for many months. However, when the temperature rises above 0 degrees Celsius, the ice begins to melt. Lake ice is similar to river ice, but it can be much thicker, since lakes don't have the constant flow of water that rivers do. As the ice melts, the water flows back into the lake, raising the water level. If this happens suddenly, it can cause flooding. River and lake ice also plays an important role in the ecosystem by providing habitat for fish and other aquatic creatures. When the ice melts, these habitats are destroyed and the animals living there are forced to move elsewhere. I'm going to try and find out in this video. So let's start. The average temperature at which ice melts is 0 degrees Celsius, or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The first ice to go would be lake ice and river ice. Next would be glaciers. Glaciers are formed when snow falls and accumulates over time. The weight of the snow compresses it into ice, and this ice can be hundreds of meters thick. Glaciers move very slowly, but they can carve out valleys and shape the landscape over time. As glaciers melt, they release huge amounts of water into the ocean, which can raise sea levels. Glaciers also play an important role in the water cycle. They store fresh water that eventually makes its way back into rivers and lakes, which is then used by humans and other animals. When glaciers melt, the water they release is often lower quality and can't be used for drinking or irrigation. Glaciers also reflect a lot of sunlight back into space, which helps to keep the Earth cool. As glaciers melt, less sunlight is reflected and more is absorbed by the dark ocean water, which heats up and releases even more heat. This can trigger a positive feedback loop leading to further warming and melting. Some of the most famous glaciers in the world include the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, which hold about 99% of all fresh water. If these glaciers melted, sea levels would rise by 70 meters or 230 feet. Cities like New York, London, and Tokyo would be underwater, and more than 100 million people would be displaced. As we mentioned earlier, when temperatures rise above 0 degrees Celsius, ice begins to melt. But what happens when temperatures rise much higher? Now let's go even higher to 50 degrees Celsius. If the temperature continued to rise to 100 degrees Celsius, almost all of the ice would have melted, and sea levels would be about 80 meters or 262 feet higher than today. At 200 degrees Celsius, almost all of the ice would have melted, and sea levels would be about 95 meters or 312 feet higher than today. So if all the ice on Earth melted overnight, the consequences would be catastrophic. You might be thinking, why is it important to understand what would happen if all of the ice on Earth melted overnight? Well, the consequences of rising sea levels and climate change are serious. It's important to remember that we have the ability to take action to mitigate those risks and build a more sustainable future. Well, that's all for today. What do you think would happen if all of the ice on Earth melted overnight?